How long do y'all think we've been in this hole? Rick asked. He squinted in a dark, windowless room. Nearly a decent, Mavner said, groaning as he shifted his weight. Why do you think he put us in here? Elise asked. She leaned on the metal bars that separated them from each other. You tell us, Denishku said. He stood, approaching her while he twisted a band on his wrist. You have been in here 12 Velrins. Scoffing, Elise shook her head. 12 Velrins? I was unconscious for most of it. He was primarily preoccupied with trying to convert me into one of him. 12 Velrins. She ran her hand up and down her arm, hitting the band on her wrist. When she felt the cold metal, she spun it around and examined it. What do you think these bracelets we've got are for? If we all have them, it's probably not good, right? I do not know, but I concur that it is unlikely the reason is benevolent. Mavner clinked his band against the bars. Gushunk! The door to the dungeon-esque room opened, and Sefk strutted in. Salutations, mortals. I have come to welcome you to a new life. With this, he motioned to an injection gun in the hands of his accompanying Gucairn guard, you will be reborn. Rick shook his head, then snorted as he laughed. Oh yeah, when hell freezes over. The others scoffed and sneered in agreement. You misunderstand, the Abd-uri said, lifting his hand up. A metal band encircled his wrist. You will comply. Sefk tapped the bracelet, then the other 4 wristbands began to glow. With a haughty swagger, he approached Denishku. You are first, mighty Topasian officer. In helpless dismay, the others watched as Sefk extended his hand. Dragged by the pull of the bracelet, Denishku involuntarily stumbled forward. Grunting and straining, he turned in an attempt to block the connection with his body. Stop! Elise shouted. She grasped the bars and shook them in protest. The head officer fought against the pull, thrashing and sweating with exertion, but the magnetic force being created by the bracelets was tremendous. Despite his efforts, his arms slipped through the bars, crushing his shoulder against them. With the Topasian's arm extended, Sefk plucked the gun from the Kucairn's hand and easily injected the head officer's forearm with a red serum. Then the Abd-uri released Denishku, and the Topasian slumped backwards towards the ground. He groaned and gripped his shoulder in agony. After looking down at Denishku with a gloating smirk, Sefk turned to Rick. The human frowned. Oh, Krek, no. Sefk activated the bracelet, drawing Rick to the front of the cell. You should be grateful. You are weak right now, compared to what you will become, the Abd-uri said as he injected the human. If you give me superpowers, y'all are gonna die, Rick said between his teeth. He retracted his arm as soon as Sefk disconnected the bracelet. Chuckling to himself, Sefk moved to Mavner. Must you all resist? You are making it more enjoyable than I thought it would be. I prefer to reason rationally about the flaws in your logic, the Mifan spoke up. For instance, forcing entry into your society from individuals who are uninterested in joining you and imbuing them with enhanced abilities and longevity of life has a high probability of generating hostility. Mavner's cool blue gaze swept the room. Have you truly not considered the possible negative ramifications that could come from forcing these individuals into servitude amongst, likely, countless others? I am curious if you've ever contemplated, do you ever shut up? Scoffing, Sefk activated the band again, and Mavner involuntarily staggered to the door. What I recommend is that you accept the inevitability that you will become devoted to your new leader, or you will be discarded, Zogren. The Abd-uri injected Mavner, then turned to Elise. He donned a taunting smile. We are planning something special for you, you cunning wretch. The she-human remained silent. She trembled as she stared angrily at him through the bars, chuckling to himself. Sefk glanced back at his handiwork. Then he put up his nose and left the males groaning in their cells. Denizhku sat slumped against the wall while Rick and Mavner writhed on the ground. "Come on, guys," she pleaded as soon as the Abd-ure was gone. "You gotta fight it." "Ugh, it burns," Rick shouted through clenched teeth. Sweat dripped down his face, and he hugged his injected arm to his chest. "Oh," Elise clutched her head, trying to think. "Denizhku, can you get out with your enhancements?" "No," he gasped, squeezing his arm. "It's strong. Some of the strongest substances I have encountered." Elise's head spun with dead-end ideas, and she kicked at the bars. After a moment of pacing, she pulled out the Heku tile and cradled it in her palm. "Come on. Think, Elise." Suddenly, the locks released. Hearing them, Elise glanced around skeptically, but she could see no one else in the darkness. She gingerly pushed on her door, then stood a moment in uncertainty when it swung open. "What the—" Rick groaned, interrupting the cacophony of thoughts that whirled in her mind. Quickly, she hid the tile away and hurried over to Rick's cell. Squinting up at her as she stood over him in the flowy white dress, he whimpered. Did I die yet?" "No," she whispered, taking a knee beside him. She set her hand on the injection site of his right arm. Then she focused on healing him. Again, she experienced an electric sensation, similar to when she had accidentally healed Denizhku earlier. Rick's eyes cleared of fog, and then grew wide. "Zale, Lewis, you been eating your Wheaties?" With a feeble laugh, she gave his arm a squeeze. "I'll explain later. Can you walk?" "I think so." Rick put his left hand over the hand she had on his arm, shaking his head. "I'm glad we found you." Tears formed in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Me too. You have a gazillion hugs coming your way after we get out of here." She gave his arm a gentle squeeze, then slipped her hand away and rushed to Denizhku. "No!" the Topacian grunted, pulling away from her. "Mavner first." "But I'm already here," she objected, incredulous. "Mavner first," the head officer insisted. He was barely able to speak, and his arm was spasming from the serum clawing through his veins. Fine." With a frustrated sigh, Elise scurried over to Mavner. "Hey, Doc," she said softly, grabbing his arm. "I hate that I no longer completely despise that title," he muttered, semi-incoherently. "Don't worry," Elise whispered. "You'll be back to your eccentric, curmudgeon-y self in no time." When he felt the curative rush course through him, his eyes grew wide. After a moment, his respiration slowed and his cognitive functions normalized. "You can heal me by mere touch." She wrinkled her nose and shrugged, then ran back to Denizhku. He watched her as she knelt beside him, sweat beaded on his brow. Taking a deep breath, Elise held out her hand. "May I?" A shudder ran through the Topacian as he extended his arm. Taking it gently, just as she had done with the others, Elise placed her hand over the injection mark. As she stared into his eyes, he gasped from the sensation of the mending transference mixed with the tingling electricity of her skin against his. "Thank you," he managed to mumble. Once she'd finished, she lifted her hand away and nodded. "If you get us off this boat, I'd say we're even." Huffing out a laugh, he flexed his hand and stretched his arms. "Very well." With a little extra effort, Denizhku got to his feet and walked to the exit. "Fortunately, I know where the pods are." "We still have to bust out of the locked room," Rick said, scowling. "Y'all got a key?" "One could say that," Denizhku said. He held up the crystal he had collected from Hadrol. "What's that?" Elise asked. "Hadrol's passkey," Denizhku answered, beaming. "They searched us," Mavner noted in surprise. There are some places even a Kukairn guard will not thoroughly examine, Dineshku said with an impish twinkle in his eye. Laughing, Rick shook his head. Well then, what are we waiting for? I will scout ahead, Dineshku said. Then he opened the door and slunk out. Thud. Just one guard? Rick asked in a low voice as he peeked around the doorpost. Elise's eyes grew. Did you break his neck, too? He will heal easily enough, Dineshku whispered when he reappeared in the doorway. I will be but a moment. Be ready. Then he whooshed away. As Mavner and Rick crouched near the door, Elise reached into her dress and pulled out the Heku tile. She ran her thumb over the flower. Thank you, Hadril, for everything. Suddenly, Dineshku was back. Come, quickly. Taking a deep breath, Elise put the tile back into her dress. However, when she did, the bracelet she also had tucked away in her dress became dislodged and slipped to the floor. She and the other two hurried out of the door after Dineshku, unknowingly leaving the Jijwus stone jewelry on the floor. No sooner had they departed than a dark figure stepped out of the deepest shadows of the room. Plucking the wrist piece off the ground, Hadril held it across his fingers and ran his thumb over the hand-woven design. You're welcome, Elise. May Kosk rue the Rin he chose you. A vengeful grin blanketed his face, and he gripped the bracelet in triumph. Meanwhile, the Dekra crew members hurried as stealthily as possible behind Dineshku. The corridors were reminiscent of a castle rather than a large vessel, sculpted sandstone-like pillars and archways with luxurious burgundy tapestries and alcoves spaced between them. However, it was eerily vacant. After a few turns in the hall, Rick whispered, Where is everyone? I was wondering the same thing, Elise spoke up. Even the alcove guards are gone. We are nearly to the access point I used when I came here, whispered Dineshku. Abruptly, he stopped. So. Ahead, a single Kukairn guard stood in the middle of the corridor. Seeing the group stall, he gestured to a door on his right. The rotation is nearly complete. You must leave now, he said softly so only Dineshku could hear him. Rushing forward as the others followed him, Dineshku eyed the Kukairn. Who are you? He stared back at the head officer without flinching. I am Jasat. Tantov hopes you will not forget your agreement. His expression twitched with surprise. Then Dineshku nodded. I keep my word. Jasat narrowed his eyes slightly, but remained otherwise motionless. He believes that. As the other three caught up to Dineshku, the Topasean moved toward the door indicated by Jasat. Opening the hatch, Dineshku glanced back at the Kukairn guard. We will do what we can. He motioned the others to enter first. Once Elise, Mavner, and Rick were through the exit, the head officer ducked in after them. With the peace service crew on their way, Jasat turned to walk nonchalantly down the hall as though nothing had happened. However, he was startled when he saw Hadril at the end of the corridor. Both of them stood a moment, first uncertain, then exchanging an unspoken vow of silence. Simultaneously, they both super-sped away, leaving an empty hall behind, now filled with secrets. Hey, Rick said softly. He nudged Elise's arm as they sat beside each other in the stolen Abda-Ure pod. Meeting his gaze, she smiled. Hey. You okay? He asked, sincerity infused in his expression. I will be. She nodded as she rubbed her hands up and down her arms. I'm just tired and a little cold. Oh, here. Rick pulled off his robe and draped it around her shoulders. Dineshku tapped on the dashboard. Head Officer Zure to Riev. Riev, this is Head Officer Zure. Benurov, please respond. After a few moments, Zashnu's voice came through the speakers. Benurov responding. Good to hear your voice, sir. Does that mean... Glancing over his shoulder at the she-human, Dinishku smiled. We've retrieved our ambassador. On Riav, Zoshnu and Tajim traded relieved expressions. We're glad to hear it, sir, Zoshnu said. We are waiting for you at the selected coordinates. We will be arriving shortly in an Obda-Ure pod, Dinishku said. He tapped away at the dashboard as he muddled his way through using it. Notify Inoadne, Zahure signing off. After landing the Obda-Ure transport pod in the docking cell beside the Sa'un, Dinishku opened the hatch. The 4 returning members of the crew piled out to the sound of applause. Nicely done, Kajnar said in approval. Elise! Zetjur squealed, barreling forward. The Domheun threw her arms around the fidgety human who was barely holding back tears.